co-authored with Remy Maisel, and Colbert's America, Satire and Democracy. She also has a column with Salon where she regularly covers politics and culture. One of the threads we're pulling throughout this symposium is just how satire influences public opinion and why and how satire is sometimes more powerful than traditional news. So I turn you over now to Professor McLennan.
Well, thank you. I think you're missing the best weather Minneapolis has seen in months. So I appreciate you taking a moment and sharing your time with me. I am thrilled to be here, and I love talking about this stuff. It's pretty much what I do. And I'm going to throw a lot of things out. Some of what's here is in the books that Roz mentioned, but some is part of a new book I'm working on called Trump is a Joke: Why Satire Makes Sense When Politics Doesn't. And I had this idea that, given the fact that I had all these amazing political cartoonists in the room, maybe while you're listening to me talk, you could just see if you wanted to gin up a book cover for me. That would be cool. Okay, so let's start with, what is it that we need to have a healthy democracy, right? So start thinking if you get these. Well, we need active citizens, i.e. they vote, they pay attention, they read the news, they maybe look at a political cartoon. We need informed citizens, so they can't just be active and stupid, right? They need to have information. And we need engaged citizens, right? So, how do we do that? Voting, community action, we need a healthy news media, we need an active public sphere, a place where people get together and debate and think through critical issues. Now, these are sort of central things that people always talk about when they talk about a healthy democracy. So, what do we have now in our democracy today? We have satire, we have millennials, and we have social media. So, that can't be good, right? Well, I'm here to tell you that it's awesome, and there's a lot of reasons why. So, a lot of my research really focused on what happened to our democracy after 9/11. So, it takes place well after the Falwell case, right? What we had after 9/11 was a crisis in citizenship, in the public sphere, in news media, and it was, in fact, satire that came to the rescue and played a really major role in keeping our democracy from completely falling apart. Now, why is that? Citizenship was already a mess well before the attacks of 9/11. Don't forget the drama of Gore, right? We then had, after 9/11, the kind of with us or against us mentality, right? This culture of fear, self-censorship, journalists are getting fired, right? Professors are getting fired. When I teach young people today, they often don't know how crazy it was. It was really tough, right? Bill Maher got fired. All right. We also had a crisis in the public sphere that happens when you're in a sort of atmosphere of surveillance and fear, right? And again, also I think because people really just didn't think that what happened that we would ever be attacked. So that was a big part of it. So the other piece of it, oops, I missed this one, was that we had a crisis in the news media. Folks forget, but after 9/11, the news media was pretty much like, yeah, whatever the president says. But there are other things that were sort of setting us up for that level of failure. The first was 1976, which is when basic cable comes in. Now, why is basic cable bad? Because now I can watch Baywatch, or I could watch the news. So what happens is that the news radically changes the television news in those days to try to be more sexy. Now, it turns out they can't really compete with women running on the beach in bathing suits, but they try. And so the news starts to become a lot more visually creative, right? The next thing that happens is CNN, 1980, because it's the first 24/7 news channel. And guess what? There just isn't that much news. So you know what they did? They started having 10 minutes of information and 20 minutes of pundits yelling at each other. This is what Colbert said on his first show, "I'm going to feel the news at you." You guys talked about Cronkite, right? So in the Cronkite era, I was a little kid, I watched Cronkite. We would watch Cronkite, we'd eat our dinner, and we'd talk about what he said. That's good for democracy because you're debating and having dialogue about the information that you got when you watch the news. Well, that all dies with CNN because they suddenly give the feelings and opinions to you. Someone's from the left, someone's from the right, someone's from the middle, someone's just a contrarian, and then they all yell at each other. So the information that you get really goes down. And then the next, of course, thing here is Fox News in 1996, which is the first openly partisan channel. People forget, but Ann Coulter used to have a show on MSNBC. You know, we just live in this land where that we have the sense of a partisan nature to the news, but that really ramps up. And then, of course, right, 9/11, fear and hype, that's the beginning of the ticker. That never goes away, right? All right, so satire fixed it because it helps remind us, right, of the actual story. I'm just going to let you think about that. So what we know, and you guys, of course, it's such a privilege for me to speak to a room of people who basically get what satire is. A lot of times I give talks, and they're like, but what's... I'm like, no, that's comedy. Comedy is not satire, right? But we know that satire emerges in force in moments of crisis. Every human culture has satire. Every community will produce it when it's being told that it's not allowed to think, when it's being told that it's supposed to just get in line and follow whoever's in power. But in the United States, you could say, without, I think, any hesitation, Vietnam would be another moment, right? But it was 9/11 that was the real crush for satire, right? And we had everyone here. We had The Onion, Michael Moore, the Yes Men, but really the center of this was Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert and the synergy of their two shows. We had a lot of satire interventions. One of the big things that changes and is really interesting to study is the way that satire had a measurable impact, not just in public opinion, but in things that actually happened in politics. Tina Fey does Sarah Palin and ruins her career. I mean, there's a lot of data on this that you can just track. Tina Fey does Sarah Palin, whoop, people don't support her. They can no longer see her as anything else but a joke. And the beauty of this is that Tina Fey does Sarah Palin by just repeating the same words. And why is that brilliant? Because you guys get it. Because impersonation is extremely funny when it requires no art, right? The irony is even bigger. But then you had Colbert at the White House Correspondents Association dinner. The first time someone sat and stood right next to the president and didn't say, "You're a lunatic." He said, "I love you. This guy's the best guy. I'm his biggest fan." And because he was embodying a huge supporter of Bush, he was able to say things that nobody could say. And you can get Bush's really pleased look on his face. But then you also had moments like Jon Stewart working to pass legislation, right? A satirist changing the law, right? Because he decided that there hadn't been enough support for the first responders after 9/11. He got behind it, and people will say, without any question, that it was Jon Stewart's initiatives that changed it. So, this speaking truthiness to power that happens when Colbert gives his speech is, again, sort of one of the pivotal things that's always true of satire, right? Becomes especially true after 9/11 when the news media itself is not giving you the flat truth, right? It's becoming more sensationalized, more entertaining, more ridiculous, and the satirists are getting more serious. So his speech was sort of one of those kinds of extraordinary moments, but it's also an extraordinary moment for what happens in the land of social media. Because the speech was actually panned, right? Nobody wanted to cover it. And it was the fans that did. There was a site that said, ilovestephencolbert.org. And that's where I saw it. And it took off. It took off because people got behind it. And they refused to let the news media sort of control it. Then, of course, we had also Colbert doing things like giving us the word truthiness, which, you know, we talked about what is it that makes satire powerful. Sometimes it's that it gives you a public vocabulary, a shared narrative, a shared way of saying something that everybody feels, but they just didn't know how to do it, right? So that's why that one cartoon sticks in your head, because it gives you the vocabulary, whether it's a visual one or a textual one. So now we're in the land of satire and fake news. You got to remember that these shows were called fake news, and it wasn't derogatory. We called it fake news. We had no idea what was coming. But one of the things that's been very tricky is that the satirists, after 9/11, weren't just talking about the problems with politicians and public figures. They were consistently attacking the flaws in the news media. This became one of the central sort of targets of satire. And of course, Stewart really gets a lot of credit for ramping that up. One of the things that then became super weird, right? All of my political scientist friends don't like to think about this, but public knowledge of issues was at its highest for viewers of Stewart and Colbert. Meanwhile, if you watch Fox News, you actually scored lower on a test of aptitude of social public issues. You score lower than people who watch no news at all. So, we're in this moment when a lot of the information that people are getting, that they're using to make decisions, right, is just deceptive, uninformed, misinformed. That's CNN calling Ebola the ISIS of biological. I mean, you got to be kidding me, right? So what we found was that the people who consume satire are more educated, not because they're just naturally smarter, which is of course true, but they were right about things. They were understanding things and having more detailed aptitude. So that is a unique thing because, again, you remember when we were talking earlier, during Vietnam, it could be Cronkite and the cartoon. We don't have a Cronkite today. We just have the satire. That's a big shift. So we just have all these polls. I could give you bunches of data. You just have to believe me, I'm right. So what happens is that, so someone like me works on this, I'm like, right, satire is helping save our nation. And they're like, no. Because satire, right, satire produces apathy, it's slacktivists. Bill O'Reilly, that's so sort of sad that I can't use him as the foil he used to be, referred to Stewart's viewers as stone slackers, right? Even though Stewart's viewers scored higher than Bill O'Reilly's on their knowledge of issues. Or hedonists, right? Because you're having fun. There's pleasure in satire, so that can't be good, right? Cynics, snark, all of this is bad. Well, it turns out it's really good. All of the research we have about what happens with satire in the brain is extremely positive. So one, people who produce satire and consume it are just simply smarter because they get nuance, they get irony, they get layers of meaning, they get that problems have multiple ways you can solve them. But there's also other super cool things that happen with the brain, right? It lets you speak truth to power in a fun way. And we know that when people are having fun, they're engaged and connected. So we have interesting data that correlates satire and cynicism and political engagement. Whereas if you like listen to crazy conspiracy theory radio, it could be cynicism and apathy, right? But the satire viewer, consumer, tends to be more active in politics. And then there's other sorts of really cool things that happen. One of the other things that happens in satire is that it constantly, you guys get this, satire is often about exposing just faulty thinking. Like you were told you could do this or this, but that's a dumb binary. And so my cartoon or my joke is going to expose that, right? We have an administration right now that's constantly making completely irrational and illogical arguments. So I've often said the biggest battle in the United States today is not between red and blue. It's between smart and stupid. And satire is just about pointing out the stupidity everywhere it can find it, right? On the left, on the right, doesn't matter. So the other piece of this is that we know that when people are engaged in satire, they enjoy participating in politics in different ways, right? So we see this in terms of the way youth culture is always engaging in politics now using satire. And so I developed this stuff called the citizen satirist, right? You know, you have professional satirists, but now we have citizen satirists everywhere. Social media has facilitated that. And we also have the satire activist, or which a friend of mine has a much better term for this. He calls it the laughtivist. So I have a friend, Sergio Popovich, who used satire pranks to help bring down Milosevic. This stuff is cool. It's happening all the time. These public interventions where satire is part of how you draw out, right, political abuse. And I can give you lots of impact. People worry. We just had this thing. Oh, what's the power of satire? So I get this question all the time because people like to be difficult, right? They're like, you think this is good, but it can't possibly be right. So I have tons of different data points, whether it's, say, somebody, again, Colbert launches a term, a hashtag, how often that hashtag is used, in what ways is it used, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We had the John Oliver example. John Oliver is a really brilliant case of a satirist who has public impact, right? I mean, there's so many examples of what he's doing that you can't even just limit it to one. So we do, in fact, have lots of evidence. Now, the thing that was interesting was that when Colbert and Stewart stepped down, a lot of folks wondered what would happen to satire. And in fact, what's happened is that we have more on the menu than ever, right? And they're all over, and they all complement each other. And so this has actually been pretty good. And one of the reasons why, again, what that makes satire in the Trump era different, think about it. When people were doing satirical jokes during the Bush era, there was a tiny twinge of like, am I going to get in trouble for this? Right? Everyone makes fun of Trump. And if you don't make fun of Trump, right, you could like lose your job or you're losing your ratings, right? This is part of what's happened to Jimmy Fallon, right? So Jimmy Kimmel jumps on the Trump bandwagon, his ratings go up. So this has all been very interesting to watch. We've never seen a moment when it's been so easy to make fun of a president sort of with no consequence, and part of that is because everyone is doing it, right? It's almost impossible to figure out where it starts and stops. The other piece of it is that we've never had a president who could watch someone impersonate him on TV and then tweet about it, like right there and then, and complain. So this is a really interesting thing, right? That, of course, satire always goes after presidents. Most of the time, what people tell you to do is to ignore it. We have a president who doesn't just ignore it, he like threatens to cancel the show or, you know, all this kind of crazy stuff. But the other thing is that, of course, Trump is a joke, but what he's doing isn't funny. So satire has really occupied this strange place where it's starting to feel like a pressure, right, to help draw out the negative and long-term effects of what happens when you don't respect democracy, you don't respect the kind of pillars of our system. So that's part of what my new book is about. And I don't know if you've seen this, but Hassan Minhaj roasted Trump at the White House Correspondents Association dinner in 2017, and it was brilliant. So if you didn't see it, please do, because much of his speech was about the First Amendment and what it means and why, in fact, right, you want to value a country that lets you say the things you do, right? Right next to the president, who in this particular case refused to go. But the fact that the White House Correspondents Association dinner has always had a comedian also tells you there's an interesting relationship, right, between the news media and comedy. So again, I mentioned the citizen satire bringing us back to social media. My guess is a couple of the people in the room don't like social media. Just gauging on the demographics here. It turns out, though, social media has lots of negatives to it, but it also, from a mobilizing democracy standpoint, is super exciting. And one of the things we're noticing is that the way people engage in politics on social media is often ironic and snarky and sassy, right? So it's certainly of some, like, comfort, right? I like this one. I used to be the only pretty blonde woman reading the fake news. Now there's a network devoted to that. But this particular tweet is a really excellent one. This came out during the government shutdown, right? And it was, a lot of people saw the tweet. But the best part about it was that the tweet was exposing the faulty logic, right? You're saying that we're supposed to compromise, but the compromise is not a compromise, right? And what's interesting is that actual tweet got read in Congress. So again, there's a direct through line that we hadn't seen before, and part of that is facilitated by social media. And so that brings me to millennials. My guess is that some of the people in the room, just like they maybe don't like social media that much, they maybe aren't sure millennials are great. But millennials, in fact, are probably the most exciting generation this country's seen, and at least since the Vietnam era, right, of young people, maybe better. Millennials understand politics. They understand the economy, because we've never had a generation of young people so completely screwed economically, and because of that, they have to pay attention. They do vote, but they may not have voted for president because it turned out they didn't like their choices. They donate blood at a higher percentage of their demographic than any other generation. They are engaged in the community. And they also can have fun, take selfies, right? Get on Twitter and be doing politics. So a lot of that is connected to how they use social media. Again, during the government shutdown pickup lines was a hashtag that was started, and it was a really excellent way of sort of laughing at the system and then thinking through ways to solve the problems. We're also seeing a lot of relationships between social media and social action, so that you kind of see this direct link between social media, social action, and enjoying the public sphere. And satire is now constantly part of it. I had someone tell me that they'd been in a march, and they said, you're right. How many signs did I see that were trying to compete to be more witty and more ironic? This is different. It wasn't like that in the 60s. This is cool. And I think it's really exciting, especially too because it gives me a reason to keep working on this. So anyway, I don't know how much of my time I used. I have 5 minutes. I also will be here all of the day. I'll be here, in the evening, so you can ask me questions about any of this anytime you want. And thank you.
Can you talk about why there's so many fewer conservative satirists?
Oh man, that's the other question I always get. So the answer people want me to give is that conservatives are like grouchy and stupid, but that's not really true. There are conservative satirists, they're just not as many. The argument that we always used to make was that conservatives believe in the status quo and satirists don't. And so, as a very fundamental thing, they want to keep authority and satirists don't. So that's why. But the news, the breaking news, a friend of mine, Dana Young, who's at the University of Delaware, has a new book that's going to come out. And she's done a bunch of research on this. And she's suggesting that one of the reasons is because conservatives don't like irony. I know. I didn't say it. She said it. It's a very dangerous argument to make. I think. I haven't read the whole study. I only read one of the short articles of it. The basic concept here, and I think it has to be historical, right? Because conservatives over time have, in fact, loved irony because then they could be superior and they could be snarky towards the people that they disdained, right? So, but it seems that in the current context, with this sort of, let's say, conservative zeitgeist, it is very hostile to nuance, which means it's hostile to irony. And that's interesting. There's another book, if you want to look at it, called The Republican Brain, that, again, suggests that that's part of it, that this idea that there's sort of, you have a problem, there's more than one way to solve it, that's something that is becoming kind of winnowed out on the conservative way of thinking. Yes?
There's been no discussion of satire as part of parody, but I think one reason, if you listen to Rush Limbaugh, he's almost a self-parody.
Yes, yeah. I mean, you know, I tried. It's always hard to get all the things that you want to, but you're right. So one of the things that, it isn't just that the news media isn't doing its job, it's that people have now sort of become consumers of personalities and not news. And so part of that story of the kind of historical pivot points, right, was the end of the fairness doctrine, which then allows Rush Limbaugh to just blather on forever and have no foil to his madness. So the rise of conservative radio is really, really dangerous. And I just wrote a piece in Salon that says the next piece of this story is the rise of Sinclair media owning local TV. So yes, that's all part of it. Because what happens is that you're being told that this is just, I am looking out for you. I'm not a crazy, bombastic lunatic. I'm reasonable. And so it starts to shift what people think is reasonable. Yeah.
Isn't there a case to be made that the satirists you're talking about are actually, ironically, defenders of the status quo? And that in as much as Donald Trump has pretty much totally trashed the status quo.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I think it just depends, again, right, on how we would define the status quo, right? So if it's something like, one of the things in my more geeky work was talking about how the satirists had to kind of clean up for the mess of postmodern theory. Which I can talk to you about more if you want. But, right, so what's truth? It's like, oh, come on, are you kidding me? Because at some point, we got to have, right, so some ability to distinguish the truth. And 9/11 really put that into stark relief when George W. Bush said, I don't know, the Geneva Conventions, they're really vague. I'm not really sure how you interpret them. At which point everyone was like, oh, yeah, there is a line and you crossed it. And so you're right, the satirists found themselves, in fact, advocating for truth, advocating for like a functioning judicial system. So that's a very good point. And I think it's probably increasingly going to be true. So I'm going to close it there just to keep us all on time, and like I said, I'll be around and I'd love to keep talking.
That's fabulous. Okay, so next on the order of service, 11:45 to 12:45 is lunch. Lunch is out in the atrium. You will need your ticket to get your box lunch. We have vegetarian, we have turkey, we have a few gluten-free type things, so please do ask if you have special needs. We'll be back in this room at 12:45 for Jack Oman's keynote address, so we'll see you soon.